All right. Well, thanks for having me. Like Zach said, I'm Jess Birken, and I like that I'm not a boring lawyer. That's a great personal brand. I'll take it. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So I've got some visual interest besides just me and my awesome virtual background here. This is my real office, but I've been kicked out because we have a Spanish exchange student living with us right now. So I'm in the living room, but we'll make it appear that I'm in my office for you. All right, let's share the slide deck. Yes, so that's me. That's my website, birkenlaw.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Jess Birken. I'm on LinkedIn. If you're a podcast person, I have a podcast called Charity Therapy. It's kind of like a Dear Abby for nonprofits. It's pretty fun. So that's me. But I'm really wondering, who do we have here today? I would love for you to throw in the chat, like, are you working for a nonprofit? Like, are you an ED? Are you program staff? Are you a board member? Are you a funder? Maybe you're from a foundation. That would be great, just to kind of help me know who is here. And then I'm going to open the chat so I can actually see what you say, just in case. Right on. We got some board members, solo employee, executive director, and a board member. Wow, Heather's busy. ED for nonprofit, manager, ED, development director. Wow. Okay. Staff, founder, board member. So kind of all over the place, but mostly you guys are great at this. I should have created like more questions for you to answer. Look at all these answers. Good job. A+ for participation. Board member, executive director. All right. So mostly inside nonprofit folks. So that helps me kind of understand where you're coming from for our time here together today. So let's go ahead and roll forward. Now, unless you have been living under a rock like this little graphic here, you probably heard about the Feeding Our Future scandal. For background, if you haven't heard about this, they're a Minnesota nonprofit. They started in 2016 for the purpose of providing food to children. They got their tax exemption in 2017 and basically started applying for federal grants right away. And somehow they received millions of dollars in federal grant funds over the last several years, which really took off in the pandemic. Obviously, we all are aware of all of the need for food security during that time. But as you might know, a huge FBI investigation and lots of press coverage got kicked off and exposed them as stealing millions of grant dollars, with the president and executive director, Amy Bach, at the center of it all. Now, of course, nobody's been convicted yet, so it's like alleged, but I didn't have time to go deep on the articles, but I did see this week the FBI has officially filed charges and arrested some folks for stealing $250 million, which is an insane amount of money. But as you can see from the headlines here, things got messy, and they've been messy. And stolen funds were allegedly used to buy fancy cars, to pay for international travel, and even to buy someone an apartment in Kenya. And since the investigation started, the board right away hired a lawyer and immediately voted to dissolve their organization. And I can only speculate that they were thinking this would extinguish their liability and maybe, stop them from being sued or something. But of course, the Minnesota Attorney General's office was having none of that and stepped in and is intervening in the dissolution. Meanwhile, the FBI comes in now with their charges and $250 million in arrests and all of this. All of this press and all of this stuff has gotten people talking. It's gotten politicians talking and proposing solutions. And everyone started pointing the finger at nonprofits as bad actors, right? And many people have called loudly for more oversight of nonprofits. I think it was Betty McCollum, who's in my district, proposed that we get rid of the 1023 EZ. All right. So like there are all sorts of proposals to like crack down, because nonprofits are horrible criminals. I just saw something on Twitter that got posted a couple of days ago saying how the halo effect of nonprofits is waning, that people aren't necessarily as trusting anymore. That probably goes for a lot of things right now. But this crackdown, this desire to regulate nonprofits even more, my perspective on that is just hold up, wait a minute. Is that really necessary? Like, as nonprofits, aren't we regulated enough? I mean, have you looked at all the rules we have to follow? So that got me kind of irritated because I have to help my clients navigate all these rules. So I thought, oh, well, wait a minute. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the things that were like totally obvious about Feeding Our Future, looking in from the outside as a person with no insider knowledge, just an internet connection. What could we have learned about this organization? So I did a little digging, and I'm going to tell you what I found. So here's a fact. This is their articles of incorporation. Now, you probably can't see this image, and that's okay. It doesn't really matter. What you need to know is I ordered the document from the Secretary of State's office, which anybody could do, and it's the free form from the state of Minnesota. The state's own website says this form does not meet IRS requirements. Even LegalZoom would have added a few paragraphs to this form and charged you $500 for the privilege. So what, right? Okay, so what? They use the free form. A lot of small nonprofits use the free form, but normally they add stuff to it so that it meets IRS standards. So we know this was not only just a little rinky-dink thing. They didn't do any research. They didn't care about what the IRS requirements were. They obviously had no help. Those are things we know. We know from this also that they got their income tax exemption, their C3 public charity status, by filing the 1023 EZ, which is the short form. And I know this by looking at this document because there's no way that this corporation would have passed IRS review on a full application. They make you actually cite which paragraph in your articles have the requirements that the IRS needs. So no human looked at this. They just got their charity status through submitting online and letting the algorithm do its work and pump out an exemption letter. So anybody that knows anything about nonprofits can tell that just from looking at this document. All right, here's another fact. This charity never filed a 990. They were incorporated in 2016. They got their exempt status in 17, and then they just never filed. They didn't file in their first fiscal year. They didn't file a 990 in their second fiscal year. They didn't file a 990 in their third fiscal year. But they were receiving millions of dollars in federal grant money. I've had plenty of clients who get revoked because they somehow forget that they're supposed to file a 990 in their first 3 years of existence. But if you were taking $2 million in federal grant money, maybe you should care about doing your taxes. So on the third year, the IRS automatically revokes you if you don't file 3 years in a row. So their computer system said, boop, you're revoked, and they lost their C3 status. So they had to file a 990 to get reinstated, and they did. And we can see that highlighted in the bottom corner. They filed one for 2020 for their fiscal year 19. So I opened the document, and here's another fact that was totally available by the time they filed for reinstatement anyway. They selected a fiscal year that exactly matches the federal government's fiscal year. Now, in my experience, nonprofits do that to make it easier to match up with their funder or their main constituent. So if you serve schools, you'll follow the school's year. If you work with the state a lot, you might follow the state's fiscal year. If you were seeking federal grant money and you knew that when you incorporated, you would probably choose to follow the fiscal year of the federal government. That makes your accounting a little bit more complicated as a small nonprofit, but it would make sense to do that and not choose a calendar year, which is what most people do. So Feeding Our Future must have had a reason why they wanted to follow the federal year, and I would speculate that they wanted to get federal grants. So let's scroll down just a little on their 990. We can see that is what they were hoping for, and that is what they got. Here's their revenue and expenses from further down the page, and I can zoom in on this a little bit. So if I crop and zoom in, we know now, because they had to file a 990 to get reinstated, they took in millions in federal grant money, and we know this from the press. But we can see for their prior year that they had to complete as part of their reinstatement, they accounted for it wrong. They called it program service revenue. And then in their 990 current year that their new accountant apparently was preparing, they did it right and classified it as grant money. So that's just interesting to me that you would lose your exemption status and then not even bother to like fix up your books and accounts before you filled out the 1990 that had millions of dollars on it. So I feel like that's a little lazy, and you can just see that right away. What else is weird about this is I feel like it's a little too clean and too efficient. Like, how are they spending $2.1 million in the year it was received? Like, that's an incredibly effective way to spend your grant money. When I was in-house at Pheasants Forever, I was in the grants team, and all I did was work on federal and state grants and some foundation grants. It's a lot of work to spend that money. So they had to have been doing it as just cutting checks to subrecipients to pass through the money, because it's really quite a bit of doing to just get your grant money spent out. And to have it all cleanly come out in 1 year is a little crazy. I also think their staff salary line is interesting because we know on their 990 that Amy Bach was getting about $100,000 in salary, which leaves 200 for everybody else at the organization. So they had a small staff and somehow were still able to spend all the money immediately. And remember, this is before the pandemic, right? So they're like just getting started because this only goes through September 30th of 2020. Wouldn't you love to see their next year's 990? Because if the FBI is charging people with 250 million in theft, I'm desperate to see what their 990 says. Oh, but wait, that's a fact. They never filed one. Nothing is on record for their next fiscal year. I wonder why. So by the time it was due, and their due date would have been February 15th, 2022, they were already under investigation and lawyered up, and they filed for dissolution 10 days after the 990 should have been filed. Am I shocked that they chose not to file their taxes? No. So what else? Is there anything else that a person with an internet connection could learn? Well, we know they were getting millions of dollars, and apparently they only had 3 board members. Now, that's perfectly appropriate for a lot of small organizations, and it is the legal minimum. But it's slightly a red flag based on how much money they were taking in. They also didn't maintain their charity registration with the Minnesota Attorney General's office. So globally here, what do we know to be true? This nonprofit was formed quick and dirty. The nonprofit apparently, from their documents, did not really care about doing it right. This nonprofit didn't file any tax forms until it lost its C3 status. They did their accounting wrong and didn't bother to fix it. They took millions in federal grant money and passed out the money very quickly on a relatively shoestring operating budget. They only had 3 board members, and they didn't keep up with their state filings. Now, this is just what I can tell from doing simple internet search. This is the minimum amount of information that anybody had the entire time they were applying for grants, well, except for the 990 that they didn't file. But you could have pulled this information and said, they haven't been filing their taxes. Maybe we shouldn't give them $10 million or $2 million or even $1. So should we be saying, hey, let's crack down on nonprofits more because they need more regulation? Or should we say, where the heck was the grant maker in all of this? And that's sort of my take, is like the grant maker really had a responsibility here. And I found an actual photograph of their contracts officer at the federal grant agency. Yes, they must have been a ghost or a skeleton, because anybody with a pulse could have said something was wrong with this situation and we should not be giving millions of dollars to this entity. So my thing is, nonprofits are already heavily regulated. We don't need to crack down more. Is anybody even paying attention? We had a comment in the chat that said Minnesota's pretty lax. Yeah, right? Because all these agencies are underfunded, and it's like it takes something huge like this to rock everybody's world, and it strikes close to home, and then everybody's scrambling and calling and like looking and wondering, is everything okay? Um, so now you might be thinking, all right, that's all well and good, but we're not feeding our future. And how does this apply to me? Like we do our annual filings, so we should be okay, right? And I would say to that, yes, but what are your actual systems that you have in place to know when things aren't going well? Because I see very frequently, really all I do is work with small nonprofits. You know, if somebody's in hospitals or higher ed, they don't hire Jess Birken, the solo attorney. They go downtown to Gray Plant Moody, right? I'm working with the little guys, the little pet rescues, the little churches, the little organizations, not the big dogs. So I see a lot of good-hearted, well-meaning nonprofits who really care and are nothing like Feeding Our Future, but they still have stuff blow up in their face, and maybe they're going to apply for a grant, and all of a sudden they realize that the grant funder is saying, you're not a C3, we won't fund you. We'd love to, but you're not a C3. And they're like, what? And then they realize that they've been revoked, or some other thing is happening, right? They find out that their executive director has been paying themselves, 60 additional days of PTO every year, and nobody noticed, or something like that. That might not make the New York Times, but it still feels bad. And we don't want to feel bad. We don't want to experience those shame spirals that come from having things fall apart on our watch. So if we give out grants, we should be looking at these things, right? We should be actually just doing a little health check on organizations. And if we're inside a nonprofit, which is most of us here today, we should talk about what can cause these problems and sort of how to avoid them, right? Because we don't want to even be a tiny version of Feeding Our Future. Although I think it would take a lot of bad intent to be even a tiny version. So here's one problem I see. Often when the client comes to me because everything went off the rails, it's because there was only one person holding everything together. There's one person who knew everything, and one person doing everything does not count as a system. So if that person drops the ball, you could never know because you were relying on that person. I had a client where the ED was, they're doing a ton of stuff. They were overworked and under-resourced. They prepared the 990 themselves, which they probably shouldn't have done. And then they showed it to the board and said they would file it, and they just never did. And then the ED got fired, and then the board dropped the ball too, and they didn't file the 990. And this client ended up with tens of thousands of dollars in IRS penalties for not filing on time. And so when you rely on just one person, it's really a problem. And when you only rely on the board, it can also become a problem because everybody thinks somebody else is doing it. And maybe everybody thinks the treasurer is doing it, but the treasurer's mom fell and broke their hip, and now they're really busy and they just kind of lost track of things, and nobody knows that the treasurer is not just handling it. So if there's no accountability, if we're not keeping everyone in the loop, it just leaves more room for error. So we need to build a system where we have internal accountability. Even if we can't afford an accountant, if you approve the 990 for filing at one meeting, then at the next meeting, you should close the loop and get confirmation that the 990 was filed. Put it on the agenda as old business, right? Just close the loop. Build these little checks and balances in to make sure that your basic health things are getting done. If you have an accountant preparing the 990, make sure you get the confirmation page from pay.gov to prove that the 990 was filed. I can't tell you how many times I've had a small nonprofit say, oh, my son-in-law's a CPA at such and such firm, and he's doing it for us, only to find out that son-in-law didn't actually file it because, you know what, he was doing it for free and it kind of fell to the bottom of the pile and they got caught up in busy season, or they needed more information from the nonprofit and they asked for it and the nonprofit forgot to answer. And so it just didn't get filed because it was in the client's court. Like this stuff happens all the time. So you just really need to build a system. And it's never a problem for an accountant to provide the confirmation page from pay.gov. Like that's print a screenshot. It's not a big deal. You can go back into it later even and print one off. It's totally doable. Here's a question we have. Is the 990 form supposed to be approved by the board? Yes, that is a great question. You are, as the board, you are ultimately responsible. Yes, you may delegate the work to someone else, but you should absolutely go through the 990, have the person who prepared it explain to you what's going on the document. A lot of times this is the board meeting where everybody's eyes glass over and you're kind of like, when is it over? When can there be a motion to approve? Try and have the person explain what is going on in the document. Make sure you're using it as a communication tool. Put real meaty stuff in there about your programs and what you accomplish and what your purpose is. This is the thing that people look at when they're checking you out, right? If you're looking for, like, I want to make a big gift to this organization and I'm a savvy donor, I'm going to pull their 990. If I'm a foundation and I'm going to, look at your 990 and see what your accomplishments have been. The 990 is a communication tool and absolutely the board should be approving it. Great question, Lynn. Thank you. All right, here's another problem I run into with smaller nonprofits. We just tend to ostrich. As nonprofits, and I've experienced this myself, and I'm like an extroverted, outgoing, direct communicator. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is on the other side of the Mississippi River, so I'm a little bit more direct than a native Minnesotan. We just don't like to admit or look at it if something isn't right, so we can tend to sort of ignore the problem. And that's normal. This is compounded by Minnesota's culture of indirect communication and not really liking to bring stuff up that's negative or having like a perceived conflict. But it really can lead to unresolved issues continually getting put on the back burner. And, it's not the fun part. And I don't know if you're familiar with this meme, but it's one of my favorites. And it occurred to me to use it for this. The fun part is nonprofit mission delivery, right? Just the feel good stuff is like, let's go save the snails or help the kids or whatever we're supposed to be doing. Nonprofit compliance, boring. Like, did anybody sign up to be on a board ever because they wanted to revise bylaws? No, they do not. And I know that, that's only human. And it's just so common and it's so easy to just ignore the stuff that sucks and do the stuff that's fun. So focusing on the mission delivery and ignoring the paperwork is just a really common problem. And not to mention we're expected to do a lot with very little. And it's just really difficult to stay on top of everything. Again, if you don't have a good system for tracking it all, and if it's something that you lack experience with doing and it's new to you, which happens a lot with small nonprofits as boards turn over and you're getting involved not because you love compliance, but because you love the pet rescue. You've never had to read a 990 or deal with policies like that. So it's one of the problems that small nonprofits have. Amy says she likes revising bylaws, clearly an anomaly. Yes, you are. Amy, you should probably come work with me then. That's what I'm saying. Amy and Renee are going to form the bylaws revision club because they both like it. There is probably something wrong with you both. And me. It's all good. All right. So what are we supposed to do about it? Get help, get support. Even if it's a free educational seminar like this or something else, maybe your organization legitimately can't afford a professional to do it, but I would say get help and invest in yourself as a nonprofit. You're only as good as your infrastructure and the systems you have in place to keep it healthy. I can share one sort of like personal example of that. Before we started the program, I was telling Zach and Tammy how I've gotten a bunch of concussions. About a year ago, just through a series of fluke events, I got like 3 head injuries. And it really impacted my ability to look at a computer screen, which is kind of a problem if you are a lawyer. So I fortunately had built so many systems at my firm that my very small team and all of my sort of like technological automations and things have all been able to be there to support me, as I haven't been able to be 100% at my desk. And that is the same kind of thing that you need at your nonprofit. If you got hit by a bus tomorrow, would everybody know what to do, right? For my solo employee executive director, you're the only person, folks out there. Is there documentation? Is there a backup plan? What, like, some of those things we need to have so that we don't get in trouble through accident or, through bad actions. Jody's saying checks and balances are essential. Amen. Amen to that. So one thing I just want to throw out there is that checklist of things that I sort of went through as an external person. I sort of developed a little quick tool that you could use. If you want to go through that for any nonprofit, you can just go to this birkenlaw.com/healthy nonprofit. And I built a little form that will take you through, here are the things that you should check, right? And this sort of funder health check, external check, that's great for you're involved with a nonprofit, but you're considering joining the board, or you're on the board and you're new, or you want to give to the organization and you just want to check them out. These should be like your baseline items to look for. IRS status on the exempt entities search, current 990s, whether their registration is current with the Secretary of State's office. Do they register with the AG's office, and are they in this charity search? Do they have transparency about their financials and other outcomes? Like, is their website just non-existent? That is all stuff that Feeding Our Future was missing, and it's a huge red flag. So your baseline for your own organization should look good. And those are the things that you need to know before asking for or giving funds. Those are the things that are like externally obvious. And then we have that other layer, which is like what's inside, So if the stuff that's on the surface looks bad, I can only imagine that the stuff inside is rotten. The stuff inside is the only way you know that is if you are part of the organization. Only people in the organization really know and monitor these things. So as a board member or an ED, it's really your job to set up those systems and follow them. You can check, like Feeding Our Future did, you can check, yes, we have a conflicts of interest policy, but are you actually following it? Do you actually deal with conflicts at every board meeting? Do you have a call for conflicts at the top of the meeting to just get it out of the way? Do you document when people have recused themselves from a discussion because of a conflict? Those sorts of things. Do you have good governance? Are you getting Amy and Renee to update your bylaws with you once in a while? Are you doing your IRS compliance? Do you have adequate insurance? Are you doing accounting right? Are you still doing accounting in an Excel sheet, right? Like, do you know where your restricted gifts are? How's your HR and employment law? We're not exempt from those requirements just because we're a tiny charity. If we have a W-2 employee, all the employment law applies. What are our financial policies and procedures? Do we have those internal controls and segregation of duties? Do we have checks and balances in place like Jody was talking about? Do we have fundraising practices that are ethical? Do we do our fundraising compliance? These things, donor communications. These are good things that you need to work on that nobody outside of your organization can check. Lynn is asking, is the link the actual checklist that you can use? Yes, it is. And I will throw that link up again at the end if you didn't note it down. Just checking for more questions. We're doing good. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'm happy to do more of those. All right. So that's all well and good. You have to have these systems, but you have to be willing to pay for these things, right? Now, how many of us are familiar with this pie chart? Probably every single person has seen this kind of chart. And what is this chart? It's the thing that's in our annual report. It's on our websites. It makes me cringe every time I see it. Why? Because what does it say to donors? Infrastructure is bad. We are committing a sin when we spend on this. Look at how good we are because our bad part is so small. You know what this also says? We can't take care of ourselves. We aren't going to innovate. We aren't going to be efficient or try new things or change because we are so scared that you'll judge us, donor. And we need to ask donors and funders to let us be strong and to grow strong and have core supports in place. We need to ask them to give us Gen Op money so that we can pay for the things we need that make our organization stronger. Can you run a soup kitchen without the back office? No. You need someone to cut the checks. Someone has to buy the soup. Someone has to inventory the soup. Someone has to keep up with the food licensing and meet the donors and the funders and ask for money. Those are not direct program expenses. They are core mission support and they are not bad. So we shouldn't go without them. So one way we can continue to like alleviate this problem for ourselves and build stronger nonprofits and avoid those errors or scandals that just come from not having those good supports in place is to stop using this kind of a chart and use this kind of a model. This is a graphic from an article by Kurt Klotz, who was at Clifton Larson Allen now, but was formerly at Propel Nonprofits, about it's like an article about re-envisioning your overhead as program support. And here in the graphic, you can see that each program has a share of the direct expenses, and it shares direct expenses, and it shares some of the administrative expenses, and every program benefits from those things. This is a much more accurate way to depict how your programs utilize the infrastructure at an organization. And it's not saying it's bad. It communicates it's necessary. And maybe it's communicating the relative size, right? Like the admin costs are small, the fundraising costs are small. But with this chart, without it, there would be a hole in the chart, like a literal hole. And it can't be filled up with more program. The old pie chart, it seems like if you just could get rid of your admin, you could have more program. But that's a fallacy. You can't do that. You have to have the core support. So this is a really great way to like get our mindset shifting and avoid becoming a statistic on a very micro scale compared to feeding our future, or being embarrassed in our local community, and to really be the best we can be. So I would encourage you to like Google this phrase, true program costs, look at Propel Nonprofit stuff on this. You can get their help actually to like re-envision things like with your actual numbers. This is a really great tool. Now let me just check the questions. Let's see. Becky's asking, is there a limit to how many times an organization should be changing their bylaws? I had presented some changes and was scolded because we should just be changing our bylaws we shouldn't be changing our bylaws very often, is what I'm assuming you are asking. I would say if the bylaws aren't working for the organization in some capacity, that could trigger a change. But boards generally like really don't like bylaws changes, especially if you're a voting member organization. You got to get member approval and blah, blah, blah. I would say a lot of the times, if we're having to do lots of changes, we probably want to hit the reset button and just start over. Feel free to shoot me an email after this, and I would be happy to just take like a 30-second look at your bylaws and tell you if you should torch it or keep rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. I worked for 7 nonprofit orgs that failed due to fraud. Holy shnikes, Jody. That is an insane amount. So the struggle is real, right? I mean, this is why the politicians and the people in the press and all the things are saying, you know, nonprofits need to be regulated, and that nonprofit halo effect is dimming a little bit, because there are bad actors out there. And the reason that can happen is because we don't build up our internal systems to prevent that from happening. Like I can think of a client where they had a treasurer, they had no limit on the number of years the treasurer could serve. They didn't have very good internal controls. The treasurer had access to all of the bank accounts, and they were financially in a hardship position and they borrowed money from the nonprofit to make their house payment. They just did a transfer. And I'm sure in their mind, they just thought, I'll just borrow this money one time. And, I work really hard and they should really be paying me for all the work that I do because I'm a volunteer and this is, so much work. And then, of course, it spiraled out of control and they were just paying their house payments for like a year out of the nonprofit's bank account. And nobody figured it out until a long time went by. And that's because they didn't have those systems in place to actually check on anything. So that is like why this is so important, and to avoid becoming one of the small organizations that Jody worked for that failed due to fraud, right? We're not going to create a multi-million-dollar scandal, but we may hurt our own community or our own career in the process. All right. So we definitely have some time for questions. There's that link again for the Healthy Nonprofit Checklist. Basically, at the end of the day, it's up to us and our funders to keep ourselves accountable and to stay up to date as nonprofits and to do the boring work that's not fun, or to delegate it out and keep tabs on whether it's happening or not. We have to build a strong back office and apply systems that work to keep our organization out of these problems. Funders also need to take 30 seconds to do recipient monitoring and make sure that they're giving out money to an organization that at a baseline meets, at least visually, the criteria of being a compliant nonprofit. And I say this, and I know that all of that compliance stuff is like baked into, systemic racism and dominant culture and all that stuff. But like the reality is, these are the rules that the nonprofits have to follow. And so how do we get more general operating money so that we can build stronger organizations and deal with the laws and the rules that are out there? Because they're not going away anytime soon. What other questions do you all have for me? If you don't have any questions, I do have a little small group work we could do, but I would love to hear from you. What resonates with you? What do you think is crazy and I'm wrong about? Do you have questions? Anything you want to talk about? I am up for it. Just either come off mute or put your questions in the chat. Or you could do your little hand raise thing.
I'll jump in. Oh, you've got one here coming in. Go ahead.
Okay. I appreciate you being my plant, Zach. So Renee is asking, did you say it's possible to look up a 990 for an organization in Minnesota? It is. You can actually look up 990s for an organization anywhere. You can go to the IRS's exempt organization search. You can also go to, what is it called now? Candid. Used to be the Foundation Center, had a 990 search, but they merged with another group, and I think their name now is Candid. But if you know the name or the tax ID number of a nonprofit, you can find their 990. Also, GuideStar. Sometimes GuideStar is annoying because you have to like log in with an account, which is irritating to me. But yeah, Elizabeth is saying Candid and GuideStar, Charity Navigator. I like the IRS database personally because you get to see their determination letter, what the IRS says that they are, whether they've been revoked. You can immediately look at all of their past 990s. So that is a useful tool. All right, here's another question from Heather. Any ballpark on the percentage of budget to be spent on administrative costs? No, you need to call Propel Nonprofit. I think it very much varies and it depends on what you're doing. If you are running a nonprofit whose mission is cancer research, what percentage of money is going to be spent on admin? A crap load, because your fundraising costs are going to be almost all you do, right? Like if you are finding money to to fund research, your fundraising is through the roof. If you are doing something else, it's going to be totally different. So I don't think there is a good formula. I think it really depends on what you're doing, and then you choosing how you communicate that to your donors and abandoning that old 92 cents of every dollar goes to program and looking at the true program costs is a much better framework. Um, Amy's saying anything less than 10 or 15% of costs on admin is inefficient and unsustainable. That's probably accurate. I mean, it's like if you had a business and you were like, well, I'm take me, I'm a lawyer, but I'm going to do everything with a pen and paper and not use the internet or computer, and that'll keep my administrative overhead down to like 1%. I mean, that would be crazy, right? So it's like only in the nonprofit sector do we do this to ourselves. Okay, let me see. We got questions rolling in. Jody, Jody, what's your deal with being involved in the fraudulent nonprofits? Jody says they met a person yesterday who is the ED and the board chair. By the way, I think that was Amy Boxsteele too. She said she has to be in control, and her lawyer set it up so she can never be fired by the board, which also has family members on her board. Oh, special. I did advise her that these are real red flags for any public funding she applies for. Am I correct? Yes. And don't take a job there, or it will be the eighth organization. um, that's all a red flag. I know there's a lawyer who advertises online that they'll help, and they're not in Minnesota, but I look at these things and they're like, I can help set up your nonprofit so that you can never be fired. And I'm like, you are a scammer. That is not appropriate. There is nothing appropriate about what having yourself be not able to be fired by the board. That's not cool. Not good. Do I provide training to board members to help them understand their legal responsibilities? Yes, I do. Feel free to reach out. Absolutely. Amy is agreeing with Jody. Big red flag. Carrie is asking, my auditor wants me to do a functional expense study. I'm struggling with this. Can you provide some resources for how to determine if something is an admin expense versus a program expense? I'm not the best person to ask this, but I'm guessing that if you go to Propel Nonprofits website, they will have some resources. And I know that they've got some stuff about doing cost allocations, and I think they provide a little bit of free consulting to people. So I would probably talk with someone at Propel. And then if you need to, you could go to like private consulting with someone like Megan Tarnow from High Rock to kind of help you frame your general ledger so that things tie out to the right, get coded right. But that's kind of exceeding my, we've now left the zone where I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, Zach is confirming that Propel is very good about giving you some assistance if you just call or email. And that's kind of their sweet spot, is that like financial stuff. Kate Barr is super smart and is running Propel. Lynn is asking some questions regarding liability claims we've never gotten but want to avoid. For example, in this litigious climate, we don't want to be sued for not allowing a genre or type of art, which, and this is very detailed, Lynn. I don't know that everyone's going to benefit from this. Let's see. Well, I think what Lynn is asking is, can we get sued for not allowing something in our artistic shows or something like that? Not to be totally a lawyer, but it depends. I don't know. I don't have enough facts. We would have to like get more facts, but don't put them in the chat. Just email me. We'll figure it out. I will say nonprofits are private entities, and you're not, unless your grants make you follow public entity requirements, you're not subject to open meeting laws. You have the right to say, we don't, we only give scholarships to first time college women of color. Like, you can do those things. You're a private nonprofit within reason. There are facts and circumstances where discrimination comes into play, but you can have artistic control over some things. All right, let's see. Here's a question from Michelle. I'm a board chair. I'm trying to establish some checks and balances. I've requested from our accountants some things being sent to me to keep me in the loop, like payroll. Good. Are there any general things that a board chair should be specifically checking on to keep everyone on the up and up? Um, I would say, and again, I'm not a finance person, I'm a lawyer, but one mistake that I see small nonprofits make is they're like, oh, we have a bookkeeper, so it's all handled. Like, no. the There needs to be a reporting back. So at your monthly or your quarterly board meeting, there should be some sort of treasurer's report. There should be, a reporting back on what's the financial position of the organization, how are things going. Um, we shouldn't just outsource to a bookkeeper and be like, well, my job is done here. You do need to generate an income statement and a balance sheet, understand what's on it, have somebody do bank reconciliations. I think that going again to Propel or to Megan Tarnow or somebody who does specifically financial stuff would be helpful for you there. But it isn't good to just be like, it's outsourced, therefore it's handled. There needs to be like a loop that gets closed, and the whole board needs to be updated on the financial position of the organization periodically. And I know that's the suckiest part of every board meeting when you're doing it, but it is important. And you can get people to come and give you a really short training on how to read a balance sheet and an income statement and what does it mean. And those are really worth doing because it is hard for people who aren't numbers people. Anything else? Do I have contact information for Megan? I sure do. I can pull that up here. Zach, did you have a question?
I was just gonna start the conversation for you by just kind of asking about the one of the things that often pops up through my interactions with nonprofits is stuff that doesn't quite seem right on the labor law side of things. So if no one had any other questions, I was going to ask you for some generalities that you might see common labor law violations of small nonprofits.
I mean, I think the biggest one is just like hiring somebody on a 1099 basis when they really should be an employee. Um, that and, things around wage and hour. I mean, really take your pick. I don't know. you know, um, Discipline and discharge, making sure that you follow the rules around that. But the biggest one for small nonprofits is sort of playing real fast and loose with 1099s versus employees. And sometimes, it's like, well, as long as your ED wants to be a 1099 and it's fine, uh, probably won't get caught. But there are definitely criteria that the IRS looks at if they were ever to come across it. And that's the real like, well, what is their enforcement capacity? You're probably okay. But if somebody is being told you show up for work at this time, we provide all the tools of the job, this is how you do your work, probably they're an employee, right? So that's probably the biggest one I see. And then just in general, human beings are always the messiest part of any organization. So just inherently, the employment stuff is always going to be the most risk and the most expense. So making sure that you really have like good insurance, that you have employer's loss coverage, making sure that you keep up your work comp insurance. Those things are what I would just say generally to safeguard yourself. And then getting, good advice on any sort of HR issues that you have for sure. And that can be hard for small nonprofits, but there are services like Bambi.com is a good one where it's like a subscription based service and they help you stay compliant and they have an account manager who will help you with any discipline or termination issues, stuff like that. Good question, Zach. Thanks for being my plant. All right, Amy had one more question and then I think we're probably pretty close to ending. We just had elections for our new executive committee. We do not have a treasurer. We are rebuilding, and no one has a financial background following the resignation of our treasurer. How long can we go like this without it being an issue? That's a great question. Technically, by law in Minnesota, Chapter 317A, I always feel like I need to like push my glasses up whenever I cite the statute because it sounds so nerdy. 317A requires that we have 3 board members, and Chapter 17A requires that we have a president and a treasurer. So just because we don't have somebody who likes it or wants to do it doesn't mean that we don't need a treasurer. Unfortunately, I would probably say somebody who's already on the board should just be filling that seat, even if they know they're not very good at it. And it's probably a good time anyway to look at what support services do we need to make sure that we're not reliant on a treasurer to sort of do the books or anything. Because in an ideal world, your treasurer is really not working in the financials, they are liaising with the person who is doing it. So, that said, it can be very difficult to find somebody who is willing. And I have that conversation with small nonprofits a lot when I'm trying to get them to limit their treasurer's term of years in their bylaws. But you really do want that position to roll over periodically so that some fresh eyes come in and look at things. So I usually recommend no more than 3 concurrent years as the treasurer, and you are supposed to have one. Amy's going to get to go to that board meeting and just be like so informed. Okay, any last questions? Otherwise, I will turn it over to Zach. I think we might be done. Don't forget to type in that link and I can post that in the chat as well if you want to take a look at that. This will also actually give you access to, I have a 12-week healthy nonprofit email course where I just deliver you a 15-minute lesson by email for 12 weeks, and you could just throw them in a folder or something. But that 12-week course is to help you with what's in the box. So are you doing this? Are you doing that? Give yourself an A, give yourself a B. So if you go to this link, I'm putting it in the chat right now. You will also get access to that 12-week sort of like helping you what's inside the box, healthy nonprofit homework. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share. Lynn wants to tell me this has been great. Thank you. You all have been great. I want to say thank you for your amazing participation. You are probably the most engaged group I have ever spoken to. Thank you so much for being here and putting stuff in the chat and letting me know that you're engaged. It's so great. It's really hard virtually to kind of like, I can't see your faces, except for Bob, who I feel like was chuckling at some of my Feeding Our Future stuff. I appreciated you. Okay, so over to you, Zach and Tammy. Thank you so much for having me.